Welcome back to Driving Deals, the podcast where we explore strategies, stories, and insights shaping the world of dealership acquisitions and ownership transitions. I'm your host, Gerrick Wilkins, CEO of Omega Advisors, and as many of you know, this show is about more than just buying and selling dealerships. It's about the legacy those decisions leave behind. And as we approach the Christmas season and the close of the year, we know many dealer principals are not only looking at year-end profits, but also thinking about their impact on their families, their employees, and the communities they serve. So I am glad to be joined today by Scott Patrick, President of the National Christian Foundation of Alabama. Scott, welcome this morning.
Hi, Gerrick. Thank you for having me.
NCF has been instrumental in faith-based giving strategies across the country. So today, we're diving into how business owners can use strategic giving tools like donor-advised funds to maximize impact, reduce taxes, and build a lasting legacy. So I look forward to talking through some of these strategies with Scott and getting his insight. Now, of course, we want to remind everyone that we are not offering tax or legal advice today, but just having a conversation. So, Scott, you and I both work with owners who've poured their lives into their businesses. They've built incredible businesses. And when it's time to plan an exit, it's not just about the valuation, but about meaning. When you sit down with business owners at NCF, what's the question that you first ask about their plan?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the question, and each situation obviously is very different because the introduction to those givers can be very different. Sometimes it's somebody that we've known for a while. Sometimes I'm meeting them for the very first time. And so I try to learn a little bit about their own story, what their goals are, what their motivations are. And I find that there's both a kind of a head part and a heart part, meaning the transaction. Obviously, they're interested in, what are some tax advantaged ways we can think about doing our charitable giving. But I also like to hear just what's kind of on their mind or on their heart, because oftentimes they do have things already in mind in terms of charitable purpose, things they'd like to support, things they'd like to do with those resources. And I found it's just much more helpful if we understand some of that going into the conversation.
That's great. That's great. And when we have those conversations and they're starting to talk about legacy, do you ever see an aha moment when that dealer or that business owner realizes that giving isn't just about charity, but it can be strategic stewardship?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the fun in what we do. Oftentimes we find that business owners, they are recognizing that they are going to have more charitable capacity than they ever maybe dreamed possible. And so there's a joyfulness in that, and there's an excitement about it. There can also be, and this is the aha that I'm not always prepared for, is they can sometimes be a little burdened by it. Yeah. A lot of charitable resources, that demands some attention in terms of intentionality on how they're going to steward it. Many of them have worked so hard and been so invested in growing their companies, they just really haven't had much time to think about that piece of it, which is totally understandable. So sometimes it's a mindset shift towards, well, how do we steward this well, and do we have the resources we need, meaning advisors or just expertise or peers that can speak into some of their thinking.
And I think it's important for us to not just talk about the components, the aha moments, but how we can get into some practical integration of giving into this exit strategy. So many owners think of giving after the fact. They think, oh, good, I just got a big exit, I've got a great payday. But NCF often encourages people to plan before liquidity, and that can actually amplify the giving. So can you walk us through why pre-sale giving matters and how it can dramatically change the tax outcome of a transaction?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you know, Gerrick, and working with your clients, oftentimes this may be the single biggest liquidity event in their life. Oftentimes it is. And so if they're charitably minded, and they probably are if they're sitting down with us, they're thinking about, okay, how do I do this, wisely? And a lot of times, generally people are familiar with the idea of giving like appreciated securities, just stocks and whatnot, charitably, and having some tax advantage there. What they don't necessarily realize is the same principles apply to other highly appreciated assets like an interest in your business, real estate, things like intellectual property, mineral rights, on and on. Anything with a low basis, it's been held for over a year, it's highly appreciated. There's a high likelihood that that could be a tax advantaged giving opportunity. So the important thing is, in order to take advantage of that opportunity, is you have to get ahead of the sale. So there has to be some homework done, thinking about talking to people like NCF and their other advisors on, what could that look like, and begin to look at some planning. NCF, for example, will provide illustrations just showing the economics of a potential gift, whether that's 10%, 15%, 20%, whatever they might like to see explored, so they can begin thinking about that along with their advisors and say, is this something we're interested in pursuing?
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Well, let's talk about a real world example now. So let's say, for example, a dealer has a store that they're selling for $10 million. If they gave part of their equity to a donor advised fund before the sale, what could that look like from a tax saving and charitable impact standpoint? And keep in mind, we understand we're not offering tax advice here.
Yes. Well, and thank you for using round numbers. That makes it a little easier. So let's just go with an example which we run into frequently, is somebody who just has a tithing mindset. They're thinking about, hey, I'd like to, 10% of whatever my proceeds are, I'd like to be able to tithe that amount, set that aside for charitable giving. And using the $10 million example, if somebody were to do that after the sale, so in other words, they're looking at their after-tax proceeds, and we'll just talk about capital gains right now just to keep it simple. So the $10 million business, 25% capital gains, assuming a zero basis on it, $7,500,000, 10% of that, $750,000, right, for charity. Now, if you back that tape up, so to speak, a few weeks, a few months, who knows, prior to an actual sale, if they were to give a 10% interest in that business to National Christian Foundation, for example, since that's who I'm representing, they would be able to give that 10% interest, $1 million value of the gift. They would get a fair market value deduction for that gift, which saves them from the capital gains treatment on that 10%. So now they've got $10 million value gift sitting in a fund at NCF. When a buyer comes along, NCF would sell its interest along with the owner. And so now the $1 million of value would go into that donor advised fund. So now you've got $1 million to give away instead of $750,000 to give away. And that's not even looking at the other implications, which is actually a deduction, right? A charitable deduction on your income tax, just on your ordinary income. And the year you sell your business, that's the year that you've got the most exposure, right?
Sure.
And so even if you can't, for whatever reason, if you couldn't use that full deduction, you've got the ability to carry that over, right, for 5 years. So it's a pretty powerful strategy, and one that it's hard to not it's hard to dismiss that, right?
Wow.
If you're really trying to maximize your charitable giving.
Wow. Well, that's great to hear, and it's amazing to see these impacts that can happen just by doing a little bit of planning ahead of time. So I'm sure as these transactions come into play with business owners, there's a lot involved with them. Can you tell us a little bit about how NCF collaborates with their advisors, like the CPAs, the estate attorneys, and even M&A consultants like myself, to make sure these strategies align with their overall exit plan?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we like to think of ourselves as just sort of a charitable partner that comes alongside in these situations. We enjoy good relationships with many of the professionals that you mentioned, and in fact, over half of the opportunities that we get introduced to come from referrals from CPAs, financial advisors, people like yourself. So we're brought into that conversation, and which we obviously very much appreciate. And then we try to offer some wisdom, but also stay in our lane in terms of the charitable aspects of what's going on, and work with the advisors to make sure that everything is moving towards the client's best interest, right? In their overall planning, because we're seeing a piece of it, right? We're seeing the charitable piece. We're not seeing all the other complexities that are going on, and so we certainly value those relationships with those other professionals that we get to work with.
Right. And you have some of those experts on staff at NCF that can help coordinate with the attorneys and so forth as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a good point. So NCF Alabama, for example, is one of 30 local NCF offices across the country. We have a staff of attorneys, most of them in Atlanta. A few are working remotely these days. But we've got roughly 10 attorneys that are exclusively devoted to business interest gifts like this, complex gift opportunities on either the gift planning side or the due diligence side. And then behind them, we've got a bunch of paralegals and asset managers and people that come along to make sure everything is done with excellence. We do, our utmost concern and priority is to make sure that the giver, the business owner, is successful in accomplishing what they want to do, and to the best of our ability, it's done the right way. Should there ever be any scrutiny from IRS or anybody else, that it would be done with excellence, and that's been our brand, if you will, since 1982 when NCF was founded.
Wow. Well, that's great. Well, we've mentioned this donor advised fund a little bit already, but I'm surprised how often we have these conversations, and a lot of people don't know what a donor advised fund is. So Scott, would you tell us exactly what is a donor advised fund and how NCF's giving fund is unique from other donor advised funds in the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, donor advised fund is an IRS tax code sanctioned giving vehicle, if you will. It's in the tax code, and essentially it allows for individuals that have, anybody can access a donor advised fund. And let me be clear about that. But it's especially beneficial for people that have either one-time or periodic liquidity events, or perhaps their income is just what I call lumpy. Like some years are amazing, some years less amazing, but when it comes to their charitable giving, they want to have a little more level, gifting plan, if you will. So a donor advised fund works much like a charitable checking account. If, for example, and I know you have a fund, but let's say I'm going to open up a fund, that initial gift into the fund, whether it's cash, appreciated securities, or even a piece of real estate that's liquidated eventually, that goes into a fund in the giver's name, my name, for example, in this one, and then it's there to be invested on the client or the giver's behalf, so they can select either from predefined pools that NCF offers, or if it's a larger sum, there's some flexibility to even have that managed outside of NCF. But those funds are invested, and then they're available for grant making. And grant making sounds a little mysterious, but it's actually really simple. You can use an online web interface. NCF, over its history, or in any given year, rather, gives to like over 90,000 charities. So,
Wow.
Most charities you're familiar with are going to be in there already, and you can actually just search, find that charity, designate a grant for whatever amount that you'd like, and then click it through. In most cases, it's going to be on its way within 2 to 3 days, and super easy, super fun, and actually we find that people just sometimes enjoy giving more with an access to a fund like that, because instead of writing checks and trying to keep up with all this, manually, it's all within the fund. And so anytime you want to look back at your history of either contributions or grants, it's all there. And it even makes it easy to celebrate little milestones when you see maybe, well, gee, we never thought we'd be able to give away that much, but we did.
Yeah. As Scott mentioned, my wife and I have been privileged to use a donor advised fund ourselves, and it has been a great vehicle for us to be able to manage that. One of the other things that I appreciate with National Christian Foundation is, even though they've got 90,000 charities in there, if there's something new that you want to add, they will help facilitate that. And the only requirement that I'm aware of is it just can't be contrary to our Christian faith.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, and I actually did not answer the second part of your question, and that's what makes
us unique. Well,
makes NCF
see,
unique.
I'm giving you a nice segue.
Yeah, I'll circle back to that. Well, really, it's three things. One is we're Christian. It says so in our name. That's our middle name, and so we like that identity because it allows us to be just quite honestly overtly Christian in terms of our statement of faith, our employment practices, and that's reflected in our granting. Now, to your point, there's people can grant to their alma mater, they can the library, the arts, any number of things they can support with their donor advised fund. But interestingly, like the local church is far and away the number one recipient of NCF grants year on year. That never changes. And then behind that, long list of charities that you would immediately recognize as some of the larger Christian ministries in this country. And so it's fun to be able to have that value alignment with the fund holders. The second we've been talking about already, and that's the expertise around complex gifts or business interest real estate. We have the best in terms of in-house expertise. Other donor advised funds oftentimes can take those gifts in, but they're going to essentially work with outside counsel to get those gifts done, whereas if you're working with NCF, you're working with NCF attorneys and experts. And then finally is just our local presence. I mentioned the 30 markets around the country, and if you look at specific cities, I mean, it's well over 100 where we have a local NCF relationship manager representative there to meet with givers, advisors, et cetera, to facilitate these kinds of conversations. And that's part of our ministry and part of what makes us different.
That's great. I appreciate that. So how quickly can someone open up a donor advised fund? And you've talked a little bit about the type of assets that can be donated already, but tell us a little bit about what that process looks like.
Yeah, well, it's a timely question because this time of year, a lot of people are opening funds.
Yeah, it's year end, great time.
Yeah. So typically that's it's nearly immediate. It's actually overnight before it's official in our system, but you can actually go online, ncfgiving.com. There's a tab, open a fund. It's really just a minimum amount of information that you need to open the fund, submit it, and then the next morning you'll be assigned a fund number. You'll get a welcome letter or email to your in basket. Of course, you have to put some money in the fund to be able to start granting out of it, but it's a very easy process.
That's great. And you mentioned year end, and I found in my case, a lot of times you start making plans and you want to make sure you can capture that deduction for year end, but you may not necessarily know where you want to give it. And making a large donation to your donor advised fund gives you that flexibility. So you talked about it can happen very, very quickly. Are there any other practical components that we should talk about when setting up a donor advised fund at year end?
There's just a question of, and I'm getting a bit in the weeds here, but it's something to think about as you're opening the fund because there'll be a primary advisor on the fund, whoever owns the fund. But it's timely to think about spouse, children, a financial advisor, anybody else that you might want to have privileges to be on the fund. And sometimes people will add their advisor just because they want to simplify transferring securities into their fund and be hands off, let their advisor take that. The reason I bring it up is because oftentimes people don't think about those things when they open the fund, and it's not until a year or two later we find out, like, wow, they've got a lot of money in there and there's no successor on the fund. Yeah. And then we have to call them up and say, hey, did you want your spouse on this fund?
You kind of need to plan accordingly.
Exactly.
So most of our listeners don't just have cash. They have complex assets. So tell us, how does NCF help structure gifts of private company stock or real estate holdings? And what does that look like? Is it a really difficult process, or do you guys help simplify that?
Well, we try to help simplify, and it's your question is an interesting one because there's so many different avenues it can go down. I've been involved where the current business structure is perfect for charitable giving, and it's very low. I'll use the word friction, but very low barriers, right, to move ahead with a charitable gift. However, sometimes, depending on the business, ownership structure, et cetera, for reasons of just making it cleaner, sometimes there are restructuring steps that can take place. NCF attorneys would work in conjunction with, the giver's counsel to have those kinds of conversations and say, is this something that would make sense, that would work, would be better here? And if so, we will help them through that process. I'm being a little bit vague here because it is so incredibly nuanced. For example, we're working with a family right now, and just because of the structure of the business, they're actually going to drop 10% of the ownership business in a separate LLC for the gifting, and for reasons that are not completely clear to me because I'm not an attorney, but it was the smart way to do it. And it was actually fairly easy because they were actually doing some repapering of the entity anyway. So sometimes there are things like that that can just make it more efficient and easier and quicker. And I would add that is the benefit of having conversations sooner rather than later in terms of somebody anticipating that they might want to do a gift. NCF does not charge to have these kinds of conversations, to get our attorneys on the phone call or Zoom, begin to find out, what's the nature of the business, what's the ownership structure, how's it taxed, and are there any ways to optimize, the giving piece of that that would be acceptable, to the parties involved.
Sure. So you can do LLC, S Corp, C Corp. Just the different components obviously come into play depending on ownership and operating agreements.
Absolutely. Although our attorneys would tell you those details matter.
Attorneys always are going to tell us that the details matter, and they keep us on pace to make sure we structure things the way we're supposed to.
That's right.
Well, tell me this: what type of timeline or process should owners expect when donating part of their company or property before sale? And how do they coordinate with buyers to ensure that it is a smooth transaction?
Well, here's a few principles just to consider. One is, in order to get the tax advantage treatment of a pre-sale gift, it has to be clearly pre-sale. And so that means if there is a prospective sale on the horizon, it's a great opportunity to begin talking about this subject, the charitable component of it. Letters of intent generally are not a problem because we've both seen people walk away from deals in a due diligence period. Once there's a binding contract to sale, it's too late to do a, quote, pre-transaction charitable gift. So the ideal is to build in, sufficient margin there so the charitable intent of the giver is clear.
Sure. So, and I think the all in all component to think about is to plan ahead, because when you're making these decisions last minute, they can be problematic. So it is important to think about these things ahead of time. They don't require significant time ahead where you have to take years in advance, but you should take appropriate time
Yeah.
not a transaction.
Yeah, and as far as NCF and just working with the givers advisors, I mean, typically allow for a couple of weeks to get documentation back and forth, due diligence on NCF's part. NCF as a charitable owner, there is a due diligence process involved. Sometimes people are a little surprised to hear that, but from NCF's perspective, their responsibility is to make sure that they're getting an asset that will be liquidated.
Right.
And so there's a level of due diligence there that's generally not a problem, but it takes a little bit of time just to work through that process.
But do you see certain red flags that come up on deals, waiting too long, not getting valuations done properly? Anything else that could cause a red flag on one of these?
Those things that you mentioned would seem like the obvious choice, but actually ownership structure is sometimes the more interesting one, because depending on the nature of the business, if there's multiple owners, it's a good idea just to make sure that other owners are on board with the charitable gift, and there's not any concerns there. We have seen at times that for whatever reason, there's maybe it could be a majority owner, right? But one of the owners is not happy or comfortable with this process, and then they begin to ask questions, and they either actually have influence on the deal from an ownership standpoint where they can actually derail it, or just relationally it becomes difficult. And I've seen gift opportunities not materialize because of those things, more than I've seen actually because of those other things that you mentioned.
Yeah, that makes sense that ownership interest could cause a problem, especially when you have operating agreements that provide repurchase options from other owners. And of course, people don't like to necessarily be in business with someone they don't know.
That's correct.
And I can see that happening. Good advice, good insight that we have there. Yeah. Well, let's move on to our next topic here and start talking a little bit more about family legacy, the next generation, and a little bit more about this wonderful thing called Christmas giving. So, Scott, one thing I love about NCF is how you help families make giving a shared experience. So tell us, how do you recommend business owners involve their kids or grandkids in year-end giving decisions and get them involved in this philanthropic mindset?
Yeah, I love the question, and it's an area that I personally wish I had done a better job in. Thinking about my own family, because oftentimes this is tricky. I heard a giver, a fund holder, NCF fund holder, just a few weeks ago, say that he was advised by a mentor of his. But thinking about family generosity and legacy, it's more of a marathon than a sprint. So set your expectations appropriately, because he's been walking with his family for years. And he was sharing about, some of the early eye rolls and pushbacks and lack of buy-in. But, he said, just consistency in showing up and talking about these things as our kids begin to grow up and take on more responsibility of their own, begin to resonate more. So that's just the first thing that came to mind, because I've just heard that very recently, that I think instilling and incubating, nurturing family generosity, it's an incremental thing over time. And so be patient with it, but don't give up. It's worthwhile. Another example that comes to mind on just how families do this, there's another family here in town. He and his kids, and now grandkids, meet together twice a year to talk about their giving. And the giving, interestingly, is done all out of his fund, NCF fund. Now, you can create other funds, right, and parse out assets to other family members. But he's been very intentional about making it a family event. So, kids and now grandkids, they'll bring, at these family meetings, they'll bring forth charities that they want to support. They'll tell a story. And then the family gets to say yay, nay, have a conversation. Okay. I really admire the approach, because they're really learning about each other. They're learning about new charities. They're beginning to kind of merge and bring together some of the values. because mom and dad, or grandma and grandpa in this case, right? I mean, there's going to be things they're just unaware of in terms
Sure.
of things the grandkids are interested in and passionate about. So very helpful to have those kinds of conversations.
That's great. That's great. So tell us along the same vine, what are some creative ways you've seen families use their giving fund around Christmas? Maybe giving together, as you just talked about, or supporting local ministries, or honoring employees, or what are some other creative ways? And you've already talked a little bit about that.
Yeah, the additional example that came to mind as I was reading through some of these topics that we're going to talk about is a business owner that he has been very intentional about involving his employees in giving. And holiday may or may not be part of that, but certainly it could be. But what he's done is encouraged his employees to bring forth charities that they know and love, and oftentimes, and he said there's a kind of scoring system, right? Like, have they supported this ministry personally? From a financial standpoint, have they volunteered? Do they have a family member that is benefiting or involved in a firsthand way with the ministry? Maybe they're on a board for that local ministry. So there's a little bit of a matrix they use to kind of score them, and then they look at the request, and then based upon the charitable capacity of the company that year, in terms of what kind of year they've had, they make a decision about granting. But I thought it was very creative, and he was telling us about an example of a family, or an employee in a family, that they wanted to gift $2,500 to replace a range, like an oven, and in a kitchen of a home that was being used for, and I can't remember, it was some sort of redemptive purpose, obviously. And they dug a little deeper into the needs of the ministry, and he said we were able to develop. We delivered a $25,000 check, and said, "How about a new kitchen?"
Wow.
And just to see the emotion on this giver's face, to see how joyful he was to be able to share that moment with an employee, was really moving.
That's great. And it's so encouraging to hear about these type of stories, especially this time of year, as we're all in this Christmas mindset. But let's transition as our time's wrapping up. I do want to talk a little bit about donor advised funds versus private foundations, because we do see in conversations we have with some of our clients that they go in that foundation route. So many high net worth business owners do that comparison between a donor advised fund and setting up their own private foundation. So what are some of the main differences when it comes to that? Tax deduction limits, administrative burden, control, privacy, involving future generations, and what are you seeing as some of the pros and cons in those, and knowing that not every case is the same?
Well, there's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach to charitable giving. One of the things that people are often surprised to hear about is a donor advised fund. Oftentimes, depending on what the family's trying to do, can actually accomplish maybe everything that they wanted to do with the private foundation. They just weren't aware of it. So kind of start there is like, if simple works, then maybe that's the way to go. Now, there are some differences in terms of just how they're taxed, or tax benefits rather. A private foundation, in terms of any contributions as far as appreciated assets, though you receive a basis deduction on a private foundation contribution, whereas a donor advised fund, because it's actually NCF, other donor advised funds are public charities, so you get the fair market value deduction. So depending on the kind of gifts that you were planning on making, that alone could be a big determinant on how you want to go. You mentioned privacy. And you may have heard this before, but one of the truisms in our space is public charities are actually private. Private charities are actually public in terms of what's revealed in terms of your financial statements, the Form 990 or the equivalent for a private foundation, where you actually show us where the granting is going. For families that would prefer to do at least some of their gifting or granting anonymously, you can do that through National Christian Foundation, and you as an individual donor are never disclosed in terms of NCS 990, right?
Right.
So that can be a determinant as well. Private foundations do have some flexibility that a DAF doesn't in terms of potentially employing family members, and sometimes that is part of a family's plan, as they want to be able to hire a family member to administer the program and do some granting. So that's something you can't do. One thing just to put in a placeholder, in case it ever comes up, is for families that have significant wealth in terms of charitable assets, rather. NCF actually has an alternative organization called a supporting organization, which is a bit of a hybrid. It functions much the way a private foundation does, but it's within the umbrella of NCF, a public charity, and there's a whole lot of detail wrapped around that. But for families that have, let's say, over $10 million in charitable assets that they plan to give away, that can be an attractive vehicle, because you can have a lot more flexibility in terms of investment options within the supporting organization, and you can also do some very specific ministry activities as well. One of the things that we often tell people about is Tim Tebow Foundation was originally an NCF supporting organization.
Okay.
And it outgrew NCF and pulled away and became its own foundation. But that happens sometimes. So NCF does have some alternative vehicles for things like that.
That's great. That's encouraging to hear. But you probably see there's also times where someone may want to have both a foundation and a donor advised fund.
Yes, and actually that happens quite frequently. A private foundation can open up a donor advised fund and can transfer assets to that donor advised fund for granting. And so that sometimes is done for a myriad of reasons. Just to give you a couple of examples, I'm working with a family now that they do, for whatever reason, they want to use NCF for their Christian or faith-based giving, while they're using the private foundation for other giving. That's a family decision that they came to. We've also seen situations where the private foundation will actually, rather than have all the meetings of the private foundation to decide how all the granting is going to happen and all get the unanimity in terms of decisions, they actually will create donor advised funds for specific family members, make contributions to those funds, let those individual families grant out as they wish. So it's a bit of a way to address an issue there where the family was having a tough time getting on the same page with respect to their granting. And then the other thing, which I mentioned, private foundations occasionally want to be able to do some granting that's anonymous. There's nothing, there's no ill motive there. It's just that, they would like to be able to make a one-time gift and not, be in the situation of having to follow up, right, with that particular ministry on an ongoing basis. So it's a way to get an anonymous gift to a worthy organization and be able to just do it, anonymously, as opposed to tying it to the foundation.
Well, that's excellent. This has been a great discussion this morning, Scott. Thank you again for this conversation. I know our listeners think about year-end planning and stewardship and strategies, and I think this is very timely for them. So whether you're considering a donor-advised fund, complex asset gifts, or building a multi-generational legacy, there's no better time than now to start those conversations. Scott, tell us, what's the best way for listeners to connect with you and to learn more about National Christian Foundation Alabama?
Yeah, well, two ways. One is just ncfgiving.com. There's a drop down for Alabama. That's an easy way to access us. I'm on LinkedIn and generally findable here in Birmingham, at least. So yeah, I would love to speak with anybody that might have an interest.
Thank you again, Scott. Thanks for joining us on Driving Deals, where opportunity meets strategy and legacy means purpose. I'm Gerrick Wilkins. Merry Christmas, and we'll see you all next year.